So before we begin chapter 3 of Ruth, I want to explain a practice that took place in the ancient world that is being referred to in this chapter, and it's called Levirate marriage. In Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 to 10, this practice is described. It was actually a command of God. It was part of the Mosaic law. And Genesis 38 gives us an example through a rather strange story of a practice from that time that where this was something that was done and used even in the patriarchal period. This practice was used when a married man died but had no children. His widow was not to marry outside of the family, but was to be given in marriage to the brother of her husband. The first child born of this second marriage would be considered for legal purposes the child of the first husband in terms of the genealogies. In the ancient world, people knew their genealogies back many generations and recited them regularly. And so a person was remembered within the congregation of Israel if they had descendants, because then their name would be mentioned every time a genealogy was recited. And so to have no descendants would mean that your name would be, as Deuteronomy 25 put it, blotted out from the people. So since the child that is born of this second marriage would be considered the child of the first husband, that child would also be heir to the lands and possessions of the first husband. Now, if the brother of the dead man was not willing to perform this particular act for his sister-in-law, then he was publicly shamed. The widow could spit on him, and he was called an unsandaled one. He had to take his shoe off to publicly declare that he was refusing to marry his sister-in-law and raise up children in the name of his dead brother, and then he was called the unsandaled one, and there was shame attached to refusing to do this. In the Genesis 38 story, it shows us that God took this very seriously. The man in that passage, his brother had died, leaving no children, and he was not willing to publicly refuse to marry his sister-in-law, but he also didn't want her to have a child that would inherit his brother's property. And so in private, he refused to give her children, and God actually took his life for refusing to do this. We also have in this chapter an allusion again to the idea of the kinsman redeemer, which we talked about last week. So just as a quick review, a kinsman redeemer could buy back a person sold as a slave or land sold out of the family in order to pay debts. And this chapter is about the idea of redeeming or buying back land primarily. And we're going to see a little bit more of that when we get into chapter 4. A kinsman redeemer, remember, had 3 qualifications. He had to be a relative of the person that is being, or the person who had owned the land that is being redeemed. He has to have the means to redeem, and he has to be willing to do so. Okay, so Ruth chapter 3. Now Naomi's concerned for Ruth, and she wants to find a home for her. My footnote in my Bible says she wants to find her rest or protection. She says Boaz is a kinsman of ours, and she comes up with this idea. Now, you were asked to look at what she suggested, and I asked you how this struck you, how you felt about this suggestion that Naomi made regarding dressing and washing and perfuming and then going to the threshing floor where Boaz was sleeping in the middle of the night and lying down at his feet. Some of you thought it sounded manipulative, or as if Naomi is suggesting Ruth kind of be a bit seductive with Boaz. And a lot of you thought it was certainly a very bold act, which it was. I want to read a couple of passages to you from other parts of the Old Testament, or refer to them for you, even if I don't read them, and see if these illuminate this at all. I found these in a commentary I read years ago on Ruth that was written by a former Jewish rabbi. So the first one, which you can look up on your own if you like, is 2 Samuel 12, 19 to 20. And in this passage, it's about the death of the infant son born to David and Bathsheba and conceived during David's adultery with Bathsheba. And God had said that the child would die. David spent several days pleading with God for the life of his infant son. And he did not eat, he probably didn't wash, and he has been possibly rending his clothes in sorrow or wearing sackcloth and ashes, which were typical signs of mourning. When the child died, it says that David got up washed himself, put on lotions and fresh clothes, and then went and worshiped the Lord. He accepted that his son was not going to be spared, and he put off his mourning. Now you might have noticed as I just tell you that story, the same three actions that Naomi asked Ruth to take are ones that David took in washing, perfuming herself, and putting on her best clothes. Now the other passage that you could look at is in Ezekiel 16, 8 to 10. And this is a prophecy about Israel being chosen by God to be his wife. This is a symbolic imagery used throughout the Old Testament of God as the husband and Israel as his wife, and that is symbolic of the kind of relationship that they were to have and the faithfulness and commitment that was to be on the part of God's people toward God. And it's figurative language in this passage, and God speaks about Israel, and he speaks about bathing her, putting ointment on her, and then clothing her in beautiful garments. And again, you've got the same three actions. So these two passages seem to tie these three actions to a couple of major life-changing events: the laying aside of mourning in the case of David, and preparing for marriage in the figurative passage in Ezekiel. It also would have some connection in the Ezekiel passage with Israel's cleansing from her former life in order to move into a relationship, a committed relationship with God. So these passages made me think of the actions that Naomi suggested here. The cultural context might put a little different spin on these actions than what we tend to think of them as. We might tend to think of this as the seduction, or at very least manipulation, of showering, putting on perfume, and your best little black dress and your red Jimmy Choo stilettos, and then trucking off down to the local nightclub to try to ensnare a rich guy kind of thing. But that's not likely what Naomi was thinking at all. I wonder if Ruth has been dressing and presenting herself in widow's clothes, maybe even wearing ashes on her skin. And there may be a couple of reasons why she would have done so. Obviously, we don't know how long previous to this her husband had died. She may have been a fairly new widow and still actually in mourning period. Also, it's another possibility is that she's doing this as a sign to those in Bethlehem that she's not here for herself. She is a widow in mourning. She's not a woman seeking marriage. She's here for Naomi. Naomi wants Ruth to marry again, not for Ruth's romantic satisfaction, but to give her a home and children and protection and provision. But Ruth can't move forward into marriage if she's going to present herself to Boaz as a woman still in mourning for the husband that she has lost. She would have to lay aside her past in order to move forward into the blessing God has for her. Now, sometimes we have things we have to lay aside if God is going to give us a new place of blessing. I thought of three general categories of things we may have to lay aside. See if one of these might be true of you today. Maybe you need to lay aside guilt or shame. There may be some failure or sin in your past, or maybe even in your present, something that's current in your life. God forgives, but you have to let go of the guilt and the shame. You may not yet have accepted the forgiveness he provides. God has blessing for you, but you need to lay down your mourning over your failure in order to step forward into the blessing. Maybe it's a past hurt. Sometimes we have struggles or sorrows in the past, and we have a hard time releasing our grip on those things. Maybe you've been hurt in a church experience somewhere, or in marriage, or by a friend, and the pain is keeping you from stepping into a new friendship or serving in your new church because you have put up some walls to protect yourself from feeling that kind of pain and rejection again. Stepping forward into the place of God's blessing often requires us to put ourselves on the line in some way, to risk ourselves. So if we cling to past hurts, we aren't going to move forward with God. Or maybe you're holding on to something good that you lost. If you have been married before and had a happy marriage and your spouse died, but then later you married some other man, if you spent all your time looking back and saying how great your first husband was and how he did the dishes this way and how he always did this for you on your birthday, it's not going to be that great of a marriage with your current husband, because you'd be overlooking his good qualities in mourning what you have lost in the good thing you had in the past. And so your current marriage wouldn't be very healthy. That kind of thing can happen in our lives in a variety of ways. God doesn't always leave us in the church that we love, but maybe he goes and asks us to be a part of a church plant, or to leave an area where we live, or a house that we love, in order to go be a missionary in a place where it's not very easy to live. But it's going to be a place of God's blessing. Maybe God has asked you to leave your dream job or your profession so he can use you in another way, but you're clinging to the thing that you lost. So here's one of the things we can learn about how God blesses. God's blessing often requires us to lay down something in order to move into a place where he wants to bless us. What's God asking you to take off, to lay down, in order to move ahead with him? Some past sin or guilt, something that you lost that you loved and mourn, or something painful that's left you with walls and an unwillingness to risk yourself again. It can be hard to risk again, or to let go of what we loved and lost. But where God wants to take us is always better than where we are. Ruth does what Naomi suggests and goes to the threshing floor. She goes at night. Now, this is a delicate subject. She's going to be asking quite a lot of Boaz, and maybe she's not too sure of his response. So to ask when no one is around is maybe best. But it is an unattached woman. To speak to him in public when it's not about work would not be appropriate. Boaz is winnowing barley. Now, this means he's already threshed it, and then to winnow it, they usually did it in the evening when the evening breezes came up, and they would throw the barley into the air, and the evening breezes would carry the loose chaff away, and then they would just be left with the barley kernels that would be gathered up. Threshing floors were often shared by a few landowners, or there might even be only one threshing floor in a community, depending on the size of the community. Various landowners would take turns using the threshing floor. They would thresh their wheat and then winnow their wheat or their barley and then bag it up and take it away from the threshing floor. And so this threshing floor may not have been on Boaz's land. And so lots of times when you used a public threshing floor or something that was on someone else's property, the owner of the grain would often stay overnight at the threshing floor every night and sleep beside his grain so that no one else could take it. And that's likely why Boaz is sleeping there. Now, Ruth times just the way Naomi told her to. She waits till Boaz is asleep, and then she goes and uncovers his feet and lies down. The symbolism of lying at someone's feet is to demonstrate a desire either to be of service to that person or to learn from them. It's a very humble position, but it is a subservient position. And then asking someone to spread the wings of their garment over you is to ask them for protection. It's a slang phrase. We're not told how long she lay there before Boaz woke up, but some time had passed, and he wakes up and finds a woman lying at his feet. He can't see her clearly. It's pitch dark, middle of the night, and so he asks who it is. And she says, "I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, for you are a kinsman redeemer." And Boaz understands what, in these two sentences, what she's asking. She's asking for his protection in marriage, basically levirate marriage, and in mentioning the kinsman redeemer, she's also asking him to purchase the land that used to be Elimelech's and now is Naomi's. Boaz isn't put off by this. In fact, he's impressed. He calls it a greater kindness than anything that she has done before. He says he will do as she asks. It's a greater kindness to Naomi and also maybe a kindness to Boaz. Now, in our discussion, some of you already know this, but for those of you who don't, I'm about to burst your little romantic bubble about this story here. If you are picturing a lovely girl and a handsome man and a life of loving bliss, you might be a bit off base. Jewish tradition says that Boaz was an old man when he married Ruth, over 80 years old. Now, I can't say that this is fact, but this is what the rabbis teach as having been passed down as oral tradition down through the centuries. At any rate, Boaz understands exactly why she is doing this. He says in chapter 4 that he is marrying her so that the name of the dead can be maintained with his property, and so his name will not disappear from the family or town records. He sees this as a huge kindness on her part for the sake of Naomi, Naomi's dead husband, and Ruth's dead husband as well. And Boaz says everyone knows she is a woman of noble character. She has not run after the young man for her own gratification, but is doing this for the sake of others. Jewish tradition also says that Boaz was a widower at this time. It was a kindness to him, perhaps, to give him a wife to care for him in his old age and maybe provide a child for him as well. And he says he'll do what she asks. But there is a relative that is closer to Elimelech in relationship than is Boaz, and that man has the right to have the first opportunity to redeem the land. So Boaz says, if that guy won't do it, I will. Boaz has the integrity to make sure that the rights of the other man are upheld. So that man has to have the first opportunity to buy the land and then also to become responsible for Ruth. Now I want you to understand exactly what Boaz is agreeing to get into here. This is going to cost him a lot. He is agreeing to purchase the land of Elimelech, which we will see in chapter 4, Naomi has to sell. He's going to marry Ruth, and he is going to take on the support of both Ruth and Naomi for the rest of their lives. If a child results from that marriage, he will have to raise that child and provide for it during its childhood, but that child would be considered the child of Malian, Ruth's first husband, in a legal sense. And he would have to give all the land that he's purchasing from Elimelech to that child when the child is old enough to work the land, but Boaz would not be paid for any of this. He's not going to get one single shekel. It's hugely costly to be Ruth's redeemer, but Boaz is willing. Levirate marriage is not required of Boaz here in this situation because he is not a brother of Ruth's dead husband, and that was the only person who could be required to perform Levirate marriage. But he is willing on both counts, both to the Levirate marriage and to the redemption of the land. Boaz says Ruth is to remain where she is till morning. It's the middle of the night. He doesn't want her walking home, perhaps being endangering herself in the dark. And he also wants her, however, gone early in the morning before anyone knows that she has been there, so her reputation is protected. In the morning, he goes one step further and offers her 6 measures of grain poured into her shawl. Now remember, he's already allowed her to glean all over her fields. He's left extra for her to find, and now he is giving her 6 measures of barley from what his servants have picked and what he has threshed himself. His blessing for her is very generous, and so is the blessing God provides us. He is an abundant giver, giving above and beyond what is needed. And that's another lesson about God's blessing. It is lavish. I'm betting Naomi'd been up all night, waiting with bated breath, and Ruth tells her everything and shows her the grain. Naomi says in verse 18, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens. The man will not rest until the matter is settled today." This story, especially this chapter, is a beautiful picture of salvation. Redemption costs the Redeemer a huge amount. It cost Boaz a great deal, but he paid willingly. Jesus paid even more. He paid with his life, but he too paid willingly. Boaz may well have considered this whole marriage thing prior to the night Ruth asked him to marry her. He might have already had it in his mind, but he didn't do anything until she requested his help. However, once she asked, he wasn't going to rest until it was done. Jesus has long had a plan to redeem, but he doesn't provide salvation to a person until they ask. Yet once they ask, he responds immediately, without hesitation. Some of you watching this, I know you and I know you're believers, but since this is going onto YouTube, someone may watch this at some point and I don't know you. I don't know where you stand with Jesus. But even for believers, sometimes it's good to remind ourselves the huge cost of our redemption. It makes us appreciate Jesus and what he's done for us so much more. If you, however, do not know Jesus yet, he has paid the price to buy you back from sin, and it has cost him his blood and his life. That part is already done, but he will not apply his redemption to you unless you ask. But if you ask, he will willingly redeem. I think the primary lesson of this chapter is that of redemption. But for those of us who are already believers, I would like to ask you to consider what God is asking you to release, to take off, to lay down, so that he can take you further. Ruth had no idea what God had in store for her, but to even step forward towards it, she had to let go of her past, of her loss, of her sorrow, of her mourning, of her pagan background, of her own plans. And she has to do that without knowing where God is going to take her. Can you trust God enough to lay down whatever he is asking you to lay down in order to move forward into his best for you?